Greetings to all my dear 1500 to 1600s. And today I have for you a commentary on your game to memorize, which is Geller Euwe from the Zurich Candidates Tournament of 1953. One of the most famous and most epic of all tournaments ever played. And this is one of the Dojo Sensei's favorite games of chess from throughout history. So I hope you will enjoy it. Quick note on that tournament and the context. This is the tournament that Bronstein wrote the famous book about, Zurich 1953. It was a tournament to determine who would play the World Championship match against Mikhail Botvinnik. And so there were, I believe, 15 players who played a double round robin, meaning white and black, against each of the other players, which I think makes about 28 games per person. So very epic. If you've seen any of the recent candidates tournaments from FIDE, they have seemed pretty tense and epic with half as many players and half as many rounds, right? So imagine what a marathon this was, yet the quality of play was very high. Okay, neither of these two players here ended up finishing at the very top of the standings, but Euwe was already a former world champion at this time from the 30s. And anyway, here it is. First, I'm going to play through the whole game for you, and then I'm going to talk through the game at a slower pace for you, because this is a game for you to memorize, and I believe that for almost everyone it will help you memorize it if you have some understanding and thoughts and ideas about the connections between the moves and what's going on in the game. But it's nice to just have seen the whole thing and made your own little first story of it, just visually seeing this Nimzo-Indian contested here between the two players. So just developing. I'm trying not to say too much of anything about the game so far, but not just hold down the forward key blazingly like that so that you can't even see the game. So anyway, developing the knights, castling the kings. Trade. Actually, instead of using the arrow, I'll play the moves myself for you. Rook c8. We're going to leave that pawn there. Takes. That makes a better pace, right? Yeah, that makes a better pace. Keep pushing. We're going to block that pawn. We're going to bring an attacker with the rook lift. Who likes lifting their rooks? It hasn't always worked out for me, but b5. Let's use that rook lift. It's getting complicated. From here on, it's basically non-stop explosions. Knight takes. Takes. Queen recaptures in the middle. King on the run. These pieces could be improved. Okay, but now, this next move, if there's one move you remember in this entire game, it may be this next one. What did white do about this? I think they played rook c1. Want to trade rooks? I think he's headed in another direction. King on the run. There's two of them this game. And I think white played one more move before resigning. More king running. Love it. She swoops in, and here white resigned. So that's the game. It's not super long. That's 26 moves long, but it is a wild and crazy series of explosions, right, over the last 8 moves or so there. 7 or 8 moves. Let's go back to the beginning. So it starts out as a Nimzo Indian, which you may know is an opening where black tries to prevent white from playing e4. Starting with bishop b4, so the knight doesn't truly control the e4 square. Geller plays e3, which I think historically may be the most popular move against the Nimzo Indian looking to develop the king side. And Euwe plays c5, counterattacking white's center, and you can see white's not playing e4 that quickly here, so black's got time, but what they're going to pay for it with is the dark squared bishop, and white gives up time as soon as black has played c5 to bolster the situation on the dark squares and take that bishop pair. So you see c5 attacking white's central dark squares. White responds with a3, grabbing this bishop. Doop, doop. And b6. So black looks to put the bishop on b7, maybe, long diagonal. That's where you would expect white to potentially be weak, because they've just given up a knight for a dark squared bishop. So you'd think that white would be very strong on dark squares right now with this unopposed bishop, but that if black could get control of the light squares, especially e4 here, those might be hard for white to contest with this bishop here, right? Also, if you can control those squares, you could keep this bishop from getting out by preventing the move e4. Still one of the main ideas of this opening, right? Now, b6 could also let the bishop go to a6 instead of b7. It won't have a nice long diagonal there. It'll just have a doubled pawn to consider pressuring and trying to eat. So you'll sometimes also see the bishop come this way, and that's one nice thing about the move b6 is the bishop has actually two completely different but both viable roles over this way if you develop it here. Now, white develops the bishop before the knight here, and this is very important, and the reason has to do with fighting over this e4 square. So check out this move order. We play bishop d3 before playing knight e2 or knight f3. Depending on what black does, we actually might put the knight on different squares, right? In the game, black played bishop b7, trying to control this square, and so white played f3, not knight f3. If you play knight f3 in this position, you're going to have trouble getting control over the e4 square and advancing this pawn ever. And black can even just plunge in with the knight right away, in my opinion, and after queen c2, support the knight with f5. And yeah, it's very hard to make good use of this dark squared bishop in this position because of black's nice light square control along this diagonal. So against bishop b7, white played f3, and you can see there why the bishop came to d3, because we're going to need to develop the knight to e2, but that means we needed to get the bishop out first, right? If you go back to this position. If you want your bishop d3 on knight e2, there's only one move order to do it. It's got to be bishop d3. If you play knight e2, how are you going to play bishop d3? Okay, so bishop d3 has to be the order. Now, if black played bishop a6 instead of b7, then I think it's possible white might have switched tack and developed the knight to f3. Certainly they could have immediately played e4, because black's not even controlling that square, letting this bishop out. And then if black plays, let's say, knight c6, for example, I think the move knight f3 is maybe even more likely than knight e2, just as an example. But so in the game, bishop b7 and the flexibility, the knight is now going to give up the f3 square to the pawn to make sure this bishop can get out and that white can, come trundling forward in the center. I think black developed the knight before castling because I think it went like castles in the game. Let me see. Yeah, I'm going to predict knight c6 here. Whew. I got it. Whew. If the sensei can't memorize it, what are you guys going to do? All right, knight e2. Which is where that wanted to go, and now they both get castling done. And now the opening's almost done. Not quite, but almost. And black starts in on the middle game a move before white here. Okay, you can see that black's ahead of tempo and development, right? Because black castled first and white's bishop is still on c1. And we could trace that back to 2 pawn moves of white's. a3 and f3 are both aggressive moves trying to get a positional advantage at the cost of time. That can be worth it because the value of time changes in different positions, and the positional advantage you're extracting may be great or small. The idea of a3 was to get the bishop pair and the unopposed bishop on c1, who's already highlighted. And the idea of f3 was to control the e4 square and be able to build up a monster center and actually loose this unopposed bishop on c1. So it becomes a monster rather than the piece that's keeping your rooks from coordinating and the reason why you're behind in development. If the whole reason you're behind in development is to have a bad bishop on c1, that's making no sense, right? So white's going to be a move or two behind here as far as who's in the opening and who's in the middle game. White's in the opening right now. Black's in the middle game. And black picks a middle game plan, which is to attack the pawn on c4, one of these 2 doubled pawns. There's all kinds of other plans available to black. I mean, I think in theory there's a plan where you play d5 to make it harder for white to play e4 and just so that the whole center is more opened up. There's another plan where you try to blockade on every dark square with d6 and e5. So kind of erecting a barrier in advance against this bishop that'll potentially get out. So there's different plans possible, but black goes for a major middle game plan, which is to attack the pawn on c4. Why? It can't be defended by any other pawn. Why? White has a dark squared bishop, so white is liable to lose control of a light square. So this target is very, very well selected. It is already a weak pawn at the moment when black plays knight a5 aiming at it. Note it also can't move. It's blocked on c5 already. So it's blockaded, can't be defended by other pawns, and it's on a light square. In general, already with white having the dark square bishop, black has good prospects of winning control of light squares, and white has good prospects of winning control of dark squares. So black's going to go after this pawn here. And it's well chosen, and it's very thematic for the Nimzo Indian. Okay, so knight e5 comes in, and white plays another move that doesn't really finish their development. If they were just trying to literally get pieces off the back rank, you'd play bishop d2, and then your pieces are a little more coordinating, queen c2, and your rooks are connected. But it's going to be a low quality of development, right? The bishop on d2, and white's not advancing any aggressive plan themselves. So if black continues to attack the c4 pawn, what you'll see with a move like bishop d2 is you're going to lose the c4 pawn for very, very little because you're playing a little bit too passively. I say this even though we've played 2 moves that were positionally aggressive, but somehow white's locked into playing more aggressively here as well because black's already going to use the time you've given up to try and win this pawn. So now you really need to highlight your advantage, which is space in the center and the unopposed bishop. So the only move that really does that is e4. And of course it's super controversial because again, we're playing slowly. Black on their very next move could develop a rook, which is not what they did, but they could already be developing a rook and threatening to win your pawn, right? And we're a couple steps behind. In this position, sometimes it would be nice if your bishop were already out on g5 or f4 or something to be able to play rook c1 and indirectly defend your c4 pawn and just have that feeling like I can also move my rooks and use all my pieces, okay? But white plays e4 here. And yeah, they're just a little bit slow. But in this position, black decided to prepare for the move e5 and move the knight back in advance. Excuse me. Okay. So black retreats the knight, gets out of the way of e5, and this means that now if white plays e5, black has a whole move to fight back against this pawn if they want to. Black could play a move like f5, blocking off the bishop and gaining space on this side of the board. Black could play a move like d6, trying to trade open all these pawns in the center. So it just gives black a chance to react flexibly whenever e5 comes. If in this position here you ignore e5 and continue with your plans like bishop a6 or rook c8 kind of moves that I suggested, then this e5 is always hanging over the knight and there's no time to respond to it. I mean, I also thought about the move d6 when I first saw this position as a logical move for black, trying to hold some of the dark squares, but it doesn't really go the best with the very fast knight a5 lines, right? Because if you're trying to contest the e5 square, why do we move the knight away, right? Why not first establish d6 and e5 control for black and then look for your chance to move away? So actually, when you see people go for the super fast attack against c4 with knight a5, bishop a6, rook c8, they're usually not even going to play d6 and e5, and I've even seen the knight, you very often see this knight just fall back to e8, and then it either jumps back out at d6, or you'll see black, it either jumps back out at d6, or you'll see black playing moves like f6 and f5, sort of sheltering the king side with the f pawn. But yeah, very, very common when they just go after c4 that the knight simply retreats. And I think this is going to be the hardest move of the game to remember for all of you. So we're just going to dwell on it for a second, okay? We're going to say white goes e4. And even though they haven't yet played e5, we get this accelerated reaction from black. The moment white plays e4, the knight drops back, getting out of the way of e5 and becoming flexible about how to defend the king side with the f pawn. Okay, and I think white responds to a knight move with a knight move. This one heads towards the king side. We're going to want to attack the king, and we could just keep moving pawns forward, right? But we're also going to need pieces. And so very, very logical to move this knight towards the king side. It'll also open up diagonals for the queen, right? So knight to g3 is next. So e4, their knight falls back. This knight comes forward, and let's see. Well, yeah, this knight in general can be strong on h5, generally attacking dark squares. You can coordinate with the queen on g4 or other things. Now, in this position, black trades before going after the c pawn. I think you'll be able to remember this, but I do want to say that when I was first reading Nimzovich, Chess Praxis, and learning about his ideas of blockading and attacking weak pawns and how he conceived of this whole opening, I saw a lot of games where he would play a move like rook c8 first. And so he introduces the threat of cd4, but he doesn't yet trade off the bad c pawn on c3. He just creates these threats, and he tries to threaten c takes d4 winning material until a point where he forces white to play d5. Then he gets very excited that white has made this concession, and there's less dynamism. The pawn on c3 is still blocking, e.g. the long diagonal. And from here, he can play a move like knight d6. He can even play e5 and f6 to blockade the game more. But he goes here, and he'll keep sieging this pawn as well. So I was used to, when I first played the Nimzovich, playing this kind of approach where you play moves like rook c8 and maybe even queen c7, just super threatening to take the pawn and trying to force your opponent to this concession of pushing. But in this position here, Euwe saw that the pawn on c4 was basically already indefensible. So he decides, instead of pressuring it and getting a concession out of white, how about I capture it? Wouldn't that be a great concession? So he trades immediately so the pawn is on an open file, and then he attacks it. And the idea is that even though there's no pawn on c5, he still controls c5, even though it's a dark square. So he thinks he's preventing white from playing c5 for now, because he'll win a pawn. And he thinks this pawn is basically impossible to defend. Now, in the lines with a knight on f3, sometimes you can hold the pawn with knight to d2. But with knight on e2, these lines, the knight can't get to c4 in any reasonable time. So if white tries defending this pawn, it's just not happening, right? Like you could play queen c2, black's got bishop a6, knight to d6. There's just no way. But I think that now I've seen some modern Nimzo Indians played where people in this kind of a situation are willing to just lose the pawn. Sometimes it's also a knight on c6 and you just lose the pawn on d4. It would be sort of like a related sacrificial idea, like if we didn't play knight a5. I just want to show you a similar idea. Let's go like rook c8, e4, knight e8, bishop a6. Oh, sorry, white's move. F4, bishop a6, starting to go after this pawn. And then sometimes you'll see a move like knight to g3. And white just gives up this pawn in the middle of the board to continue, playing for their attack. And when they lose the pawn, then they just say, okay, well now my bishops are going to be good because I've lost a pawn. Yay. Not necessarily yay, but like no big deal. No big deal I lose a pawn, right? Okay, so let me go to our position here. So black thought they had control over the c5 square, but a modern player in this position would definitely consider just playing c5 as white, with the idea being that if black takes and takes and takes, that this bishop is just going to become great. Even though we're straight up down a pawn, suddenly the black pieces, like their purpose in life is a little bit less clear. The c file's open, so we're not losing control of these squares on the c file anymore. It becomes kind of an equal situation, right, where we each have access to these squares. And now this bishop can be really good with maybe bishop e3, or I don't know, maybe bishop d2 to b4 or something like that, or maybe just bishop b2 even, right? So I think that is something that modern players would strongly consider in this position, is just playing c5. But in our game, it's kind of a classic balance of attack and attack between the two players. This is the great counterattacking game, and the players kind of just each go for their attack, and then we find a kind of balance in that situation where they're both getting attacked, but not a lot of defending going on. So black goes after the c4 pawn. This is what knight a5 introduced, and white already, going e4 and knight g3 was saying, I'm not strong on the c file. I'm not going to be strong on the c file. You're going to win the c4 pawn, whether in 2 moves or 4 moves. And I'm going to attack on the kingside dark squares while you're doing that, right? So white goes f4, just continuing their plan, right? This is going to open up the rook and the queen. Now black took the pawn, but I just wanted to point out that part of the point of retreating the knight is to sometimes play the move f5 in these positions and block the pawn on f4 so the bishop actually gets stuck again and the rook gets stuck. In this position, white can take on f5 and win a pawn. So it doesn't look as good as it sometimes is, but I want you to know, in general for the Nimzo, this f5 move is an idea. Sometimes the knight could already be on d6 and then you would see f5. Did I put a line somewhere where I make that happen? Let's say I played knight d6. Let's say we played knight d6 and white played queen c2 and black played rook c8 and white played f4, something like this. If you had this kind of a situation, I think in this position the move f5 could be a realistic defensive move you might see from black in this kind of position. And it's not like white has no chances because black has this defensive move, but it's one of the options for fighting these positions. Okay, so back to our game, and I hope too many lines aren't confusing you, but I'm trying to give you a lot of understanding from which you can then work out the moves again. So remember, in this position here, black's knight fell back, white's knight came forward, black decides to try to win the pawn. So they trade, rook c8, and white says, yep, it's yours, pushes ahead, and black takes it, and white keeps going. Now, in this position, white is threatening a very, very dangerous and powerful attacking move. Okay, so if we played a random naive move for black, white's next move would be f6. Now, it looks like f6 is defended 3 times by black and only defended once by white. So it doesn't look like f6 is in the cards, but f6 is positively banging, crushing in this position here for white if they got one more move. Why is that? Well, it's going after the dark squares, right? There's the unopposed bishop. Black's committed some pieces so far to the queen side. This is the only pawn covering dark squares, so we're trying to take it out with f6. Our knight's ready to spring into action on the dark squares and the bishop. And it just so happens that f6 is basically going to give black two choices. You take with the g-pawn and you give up, bishop h6, knight h5, etc., right? Also, you've got this doubled pawn and white can try and win it back by pressuring on their open file. Or after f6, you play knight f6, then white plays bishop g5, and because you don't have a bishop to go to e7, after f6, knight f6, bishop g5, you won't be able to prevent white from building up on f6 and again forcing a doubling of your pawns with gf6, right? White's threatening knight h5 and e5 in that position. So in this position here, to prevent this very strong move f6 by white, black goes f6 themselves, adorned with an exclamation point by myself. Very, very important, strong defensive technique. Black not only prevents f6 by white, but in general sets up some dark square defense here, right? Keeping this bishop on c1 at bay a little bit. This unopposed bishop, we've got to stop it. Okay, let me play a random move for black for you, like a5, and show you the terrible strength of f6. f6, knight f6, bishop g5, threatening e5. So maybe you could play d6 to prevent e5, I guess, would be one option. And I just want to play knight h5, basically. Maybe it's simpler to trade off the knight first so we don't worry about knight e3 tactics or anything like that. I do want to make this somewhat simple, but now let's just go knight h5. So let's say I go knight h5, and you can see that this knight can't really be defended anymore. Black's got two defenders now instead of three like before, and white's got three attackers now instead of one like before. And so basically whatever black does, other than sacking a piece with knight e3, which, it doesn't help much. White's queen came in. Other than a move like knight e3, basically on the next move, white's going to be taking on f6 and winning a pawn and opening up this king. And the position is going to look something like, takes, bishop takes. You can't contest this bishop, and if you move away, then white gives checkmate. You see what that position looks like when white gets control of f6? See how the dark squares have been shredded? Okay. Now that said, there's one super cool line for black here that I want to show you, which is b5. A really cool move, and it's relevant to the whole game because this is how black plays in the game as well. This move is highlighting the potential for counterplay with queen b6 and counterattacking actually the d4 square, even though it's a dark square. This knight on c4 is keeping white's bishop from going to b2 or e3 to defend that square, and white's sending this knight to h5, so it's not defending that square. And so black's got counterplay against d4. And here, surprisingly, black can survive the f6 move if they play this counterattacking move. It's strong enough. And since this game's really about counterattack and about the moves b5 and the color complex with f6, I think it's a very instructive variation to show you. So we're going to play f6 for white. Black's only good move is to take with the knight. If we take with the g-pawn, I just want to show you one kind of nice move for white. We go rook g4. Idea of bringing the queen and the rook to g4 or h4. So maybe knight g7 to try and keep the queen away from that square, and just knight h5 threatening to trade it and bring all the pieces, and threatening f6 as well. And you can see that black is not able to contest this area successfully, right? They could do something like falling back here to cover this square here, and at least the queen's blocked. And we check and go here, and attack the undefended rook, and then if the rook comes here, we trade it and bring in the next piece, and look at all those pieces. Surely white's coming through now, right? So gf6, not good enough here. We get a standard roaring white attack after rook f4, or probably also after knight h5. But knight f6, exclam, and black can still defend. Bishop g5, the normal move, going after this, and now queen b6. Boom! The counterattack begins. And one point is takes, check. Right? Hitting the rook, hitting the king. White's got to retreat. And the centralization of this queen is what you want to stop and look at for a moment here. Right? Because this queen is covering like this, the middle of the board in all directions. We could put a knight on e5 and blockade this bishop, or the queen on e5. We could go knight b2 and try and win the piece. We could just plop our knight into e3 and open up the rook. The queen's not yet ready to go to attack because of the rook on a1 that she needs to defend, because this queen is hitting every spot on the board. Knight e3 might win tactically as well, because your queen needs to defend this rook, but she also needs to stop knight g4. That might just be a game winner. But generally speaking, even if we didn't have a game winner here as black, this queen is covering the checkmates. She's covering the f6 square. Black could, who knows, probably just fight with f5, gaining space. Play almost any move here. The queen is so strong. That's what I want you to feel here with queen b6. So in this position here as white, I wouldn't take with the rook on f6. I think the best chance is to defend this pawn and keep the queen out of the middle of the board, right? But after queen g4 check, king here, knight e2. I play this because if I play knight e2 like this, my queen can't get to the king side, and I'm allowing knight e3 takes my rook. So I'm trying, this is just what I thought of, this is not necessarily a computer line. I thought of like this for white, defending d4. Now against a move like knight e3, I have queen f4 hitting the knight and queen f6, and vicious attack once I get control over f6. I've got at least a perpetual, but maybe I'm just checkmating because I've got control over f6. It's such a big deal. But I think with rook g8 instead, very playable position for black. They've got an extra pawn. The pressure here is keeping some of the white pieces at bay, and the rooks are able to both come over and defend the black king, while also there's counterattacks against the white king. So one component in these mating attacks for white is often playing e5 to open this bishop, and now black's already ready to take on g2. So you see the balance of counterattack coming in here from these aggressive black pieces. It's kind of holding things together for the black king, so white can't just calmly transfer 2 to 3 pieces to h7 and capture. Okay, thrilling line, right? So b5, f6, razor's edge. It was already potentially possible, and it's very much consistent with how Euwe plays this game. But at this point, he plays a very, very strong, safe move, just f6, saying, nope, no f6 for white. Okay, clean. So what does white do? Well, they're going to have to switch to another target instead of g7, actually, temporarily, because g7 is defended by the knight, the king, and we don't have access to f6 yet. So even though this knight and bishop are raring to go to h5 and h6, white decided they needed more firepower. They need the rook or the queen to participate in some way, and figured that even just swinging the queen out wasn't going to be enough just yet, so we go with a rook lift, preparing things. Rook f4, yes! This rook can come to g4 or h4, so we haven't yet fully committed to which one we're going to attack, but since there's no knight f6, and there is knight g7, it looks like white's plan is rook h4, queen h5. Now Euwe gets on with the counterplay. The only thing to do for black is to dig this queen out and counterattack over here. White played rook h4, continuing to go for this, introducing queen h5, and black plays queen b6. So now threatening queen takes d4 check. And if queen h7 check were checkmate, white could actually go for it and sack this rook, but it's not checkmate, right? If white played queen h5, black could take, king in the corner, take here, check, run. And you see this king does have a little bit of running space. White's down a rook, and they're about to get back rank mated, basically. So, to back that up, White sees that queen d4 is going to be powerful. And remember that position I showed you with the black queen on d4? I hope that position is more or less drilled into your mental memories. I hope that thing's drilled into like your chess understanding already, basically. That when that queen gets into d4, here it is. That when that queen gets into d4, she is just monstrous, covering so much of the board. Super, super piece. So after Euwe played queen b6, Geller decided to cover the pawn and found a very, very creative move here. e5, covering the pawn with the rook while it's attacking, so it doesn't force, somebody to retreat or stop attacking, right? It's still attacking. And it's opening up the bishop. That was a target square, right? So the move is, the move's doing great stuff. And also from here on, the game it's all explosions after this, as you may recall from your first viewing, right? Suddenly we're in a tactical phase where d4 is barely defended, the rook's hanging, the pawn's hanging, h7's hanging, and before we just get into calculating variations, I thought it's like a nice idea to stop in this position, look around at the different factors on the board, and ask yourself if you feel like you can predict if the attack is likely to succeed or not, right? So you can even pause the video right now if you want to do your own assessment, right? Like, do you expect White has a winning attack against Black's king or not? Or an attack strong enough to force an advantage, or an attack that's good enough for equality? I mean, which is it? White did sack a pawn, remember, right? So what is White's attack good for here? All right, I'm going to assume those who wanted to think more on their own have paused the video, and I'm going to go along and give you my assessment, which you can compare with yours, right? To me, the Black king has a minimum of defensive forces near him. He does have an almost intact pawn situation, although it's threatened, but at the moment he has a pawn situation, but a minimum of defensive pieces, right? A knight on the back rank that can't really move, that's covering a square, a rook on the back rank that's covering one square. It's not a lot, and White's pieces are pointed pretty menacingly towards that direction. If you're doing like a force count, obviously the queen needs another move to get to h5. Bishop on c1 might need to go to g5 or h6 to really be making threats and crashing through, but it feels like White's got the force count to checkmate the Black king, not just to threaten him, but to checkmate him, right? White is slightly hampered by one uncoordinated piece, the rook on a1. Black's a little bit hampered by one uncoordinated piece, the knight on e8, which also is unlikely to be able to move out of the way very often because it's going to be needed to defend g7. Now, that sounds like it's just a KO so far, right? But here's the thing. White's going to be a little bit hampered by the fact that they're very weak on these diagonals since the center is exploding, leading to the attack, right? If the center were locked, it would be a winning attack. I mean, basically, Black would just be running through the corridor while White eats one or two pawns. And the question would be, how dead is Black with the king in the center? Or, how much did White sack for the attack versus Black sack to run away? In this case, Black won one pawn and then would maybe give up two. So White might have a one pawn advantage or something like that. It might not be completely over. It depends on factors. But, normally this attack would be crushing. But here the open center is going to cause White some grief on these diagonals, right? White's going to struggle to deal with that counterplay while sending enough forces to crash through Black's pawn cover that does take some effort to break through. To me, it's instinctively not clear who should triumph in this fight to come. I would lean slightly towards White if I didn't know the end of the game, like you all do as well. And indeed, I think that this next phase did hinge on tactical skill, and it's not even now. After playing through the game, I've analyzed it like 10 times. Finally, I looked at it with a computer as well. After all of that, it's not really clear to me whether White's attack should or shouldn't be strong enough based on these factors. So it's very, very close. But I would say normally with these with the correlation, if you just look at what white's doing, the correlation of forces says white's crushing. But it's this weird element that you're intended to learn from this game, the idea of counterattack and counterplay, that tactically restrains white's ability to crash through black. So e5's played. Black took with the knight. It was also perfectly playable to take with the pawn, and white takes with the pawn, and it's also playable and also complicated, and I'm not going to get into it, okay? But I'll justify black's knight e5 move to you to help you remember this move. This move allows black to trade off the light-squared bishop that was threatening to attack the king with a shorter range piece. Look at this knight on c4. This piece is not super likely as a short range piece, or it's not easy for it to defend the king side or to attack the white king, right? So given that fact that at the moment it's sort of a shorter range piece that can't seem to get to either of these kings as quickly as this bishop can, it makes a lot of sense to me to do this and trade off the longer range piece. Also, it opens up the file for this rook, which is a big part of black counterattack. So to me, knight e5 looks better than pawn takes e5, even though looking through masses of variations, like I couldn't prove an advantage for black this way, but it makes sense at least, right? We're trading the longer range piece with a piece that can't quite keep up probably. Okay, white takes here, which is the only move that's consequent after e5, right? We have to go after h7 with tempo while hoping that this pawn's also accomplishing something or shattering some part of black's position. You can play the move bishop b1 to keep more attacking pieces, but I think this move is straight up dubious. It gives black an extra move to maybe defend h7 with h6 or g6, or a move for counterattacking, and also it further buries this rook on a1, so I feel like it's rough for white's long-term coordination. So I don't think that's a good move. I think this is the right idea, going after h7. Black's going to trade off the bishop now. That was part of the plan. And here an interesting thing to remember is that black does not defend h7. They instead capture the center pawn and let the king come wandering out or running out. And this may be tricky to figure out because black can capture on e6 with the pawn or the queen when you're trying to remember it. But black does take with the queen here. The logic is that white's d4 pawn is now pretty well guarded, so there's not tons of counterplay on d4 at the moment. And again, it's a dark square, so once white's defending it and getting developed, it's relatively easier to defend. So black takes with the queen with the idea of setting up the queen on the central light squares. Also, queen e1 in some case could be a tactic white has to really watch out for. Like for example, okay, white plays queen takes h7 check, of course, in the game, right? That was the point, was to take this pawn, king here. In this position, black's threatening queen e1 check compared to the queen on b6, right? Queen e1 check, and it would force the knight back to f1 and away from g7, and it might tie up these pieces a little bit, and yeah. And the queen would have her eye on the rook, so white's queen would have to stay honest with that as well. So the queen transfers the central squares here. And I have some variations for those who want them. You could take on e6 with the pawn. And I think this move makes sense as well. It keeps the white pieces out of f5, the knight and queen, and it makes a little bit bigger of a shelter for the black king to hang out in, right? So after like queen here, king here, yeah, he's still got kind of like a little nook to hide out in. It's a little awkward that he's in front of the knight and rook instead of behind them, but at least he's got something. And to me, this is another position that's very, very difficult to evaluate. I checked a not particularly strong engine, and it told me that it thought the position was equal. For me, I lean slightly towards black in the end because I can't evaluate it, and black has an extra pawn. So maybe that extra pawn, all else being equal, I would prefer to play the side with an extra pawn when I can't tell how the different factors play out, right? Because if you compare stuff, knight e8's hurting black's coordination a little bit. It's probably can't develop because of g7. But at the same time, this bishop b7 is so much better than the bishop c1, and opposite colored bishop positions are so much about the vicious attacks on the color squares where you've got an extra piece. And that's the crux of opposite colored bishops that you need to understand, is that on light squares, black has one extra piece. And on dark squares, white has one extra piece, full extra piece. Well, as you may know, at your skill level, an extra piece is enough to win a game. So, if white pursues a plan of attacking points on the dark squares, you would think ultimately with the extra piece, they would break through again and again and win the game. And black the same with the light squares. So very, very often the most important question in opposite colored bishop middle games is which bishop is free, which one is striking. And that's the bishop on b7. I think that on its own compensates more or less for the fact that the king had to come out a little bit and the knight on e8's discoordinating a little bit. That piece is just amazing. And for those who want, here's just like a little sample of how this position could continue. Like white could continue developing, black could set up checkmate threats on g2 so that white's rook has to deal with it, centralize the queen, and make way for the rook, which will be just a little bit better on f7. You could always still tuck your king back to f8 if white switches from the king side to the queen side, right? I think this little shifteroo, the rook will be better on the second rank defending some points. And you still can't tell who's better, right? The game is going to be complex for many, many, many more moves, so I can't really show you a full sense of how the game could go. Okay, in addition to d takes e6, I consider the move g6 to keep white's queen out of h7. Sometimes when I'm castled, I keep my opponent's queen out of h7. Maybe it's a weird thing of mine, but sometimes they threaten to put their queen on h7 and I stop them. However, here it's tricky because this move here weakens the dark squares, and black can, black has to be very, very careful about any dark square weakening move when there's this unopposed bishop, which will obviously spring right in to h6. And, for those wondering, tactically, I didn't hang pawn takes d7. So don't put a comment, David. 47-15, the pawn is hanging. No. Queen c6, threatening mate. That's my point why I have time to stop queen h7. In the game, right, black takes on e6 and gives h7. You might think pawn takes d7 was a huge threat. It's just a pawn. It's an option. So g6, I'd go bishop h6 for white. And first I came up with a crushing attack for white here on the dark squares. The rook sort of trapped, knight g7, and now just brilliant smashing moves. Look at this one. Oh! Just crashing through towards h7. And suddenly we notice, there's nobody on the king side to help this king, right? Just nobody. So if the king... I'll just show you some checkmates for fun, folks, because I like to do it. Check, here, boom! Oh! Check, here, checkmate. That's beautiful. You see what a knight and queen can do all on their own? They're corralling the king and giving the checkmate in this line. Okay, let's go back. Slightly better move, king h8, not letting white go knight e7 with check. But now simply queen h3. The pawn is keeping the king from wandering out against this rook h7 threat. And it's also stopping rook f7 from defending the rook h7 threat. If you take the knight, this is checkmate basically because the pawn, right, as I said, keeping the king from getting away. And if h5, we sack the rook because once again, a queen and knight are enough on their own. If you ever wonder whether or not you're enough, if you're a queen and a knight, you are. Look at that. Corralled and mated again. I thought this attack was really sick. Knight f5. And if pawn takes, queen takes, now we're threatening checkmate on h7. I think I went rook 8 check. And wherever the king goes, you can checkmate with queen f6, right? Got him. What else? h6, check, here. And there's two different mate threats. So that'll be mate as well. So seeing that, I thought, oh yeah, g6. Look how hard you pay for weakening the dark squares. Bishop comes in and it's all over. But the computer engine said, oh, just let white take on f8 and the game won't be over. And I don't think the engine even took this pawn. I think it played like knight d6 or some random sort of coordinating, developing move, and said, yeah, you might be a bit better, but black's not lost yet. So there you go. g6 maybe doesn't immediately lose the game, but personally, I would be very, very wary of moves like g6 when your opponent's got the unopposed dark square bishop and you're kind of giving it an invitation to your king side. All right, so back to our game. Queen e6, getting into the central light squares. White chases that king out. And you want to develop your pieces and you want to break through g7. So this is one of my favorite ways of developing a bishop. One of the best games I ever played, I got to develop my bishop to h6, and I still feel good about it to this day. Like, I got away with that. I cheated time and attack, right? Because I got to attack and develop. Anyway, it blows my mind. Bishop h6. I'm sure Geller was feeling great here. Really great. Until Euwe picked up the rook, smacked it on h8, and Geller, dropped his tea in his lap. I mean, this is the move I promised you guys would remember, right? So white's looking to tie black down to g7, expecting moves like rook g8, looking to bring this knight to f5, maybe this rook to g4, party. Maybe rook on f1, because sometimes when black's busy defending g7, you'll have an overloading tactic by breaking through f6 as well, and it's also a dark square, so it's yours. And I don't think he saw this coming yet. Rook h8, and it's just a great move. The queen had to take, and the whole point of sacking the rook was just to bring this one here for the counterattack on the light squares. See, I don't know if everybody even noticed this immediately, but the queen is covering rook c2. If you go rook c2 here, white takes it, and there's no counterattack. So rook h8, queen h8, rook c2. Vicious counterattack on c2, on g2. Square is more or less indefensible. And you may recall that in the game, white was like, trade rooks with me. And black said, I would rather checkmate, right? And king couldn't go in the corner because of rook g3. Hopefully that move many of you would have found without me showing it. So the king came out in the game, and now queen b3. A beautiful move, and I think the only one that fully deals with white here. I don't know if it's the only move that is playable, but it's the only move that wins like this. I mean, remember, white's up a full rook. We sacked a whole rook just to get into a light square with our piece, right? So this attack better be vicious, and the timing is going to be really important. Oh, one of my favorite moves, like heading to the queen side to get a king on the king side. That zig and zag on the light squares. Oh my God, it's so beautiful. And the king tried to run away from queen f3 check. There's no white piece that can cover f3. Well, actually, there's one. There's like this, right? And then check on this square here and whatever. Checkmate. So the king just moved. The queen came to f3, and now black is threatening queen f2, king d1, and then either bishop f3 or rook g1, mate. The only move that would stop that would be rook f4, and that opens up queen e3, queen d2, or rook g1, because it blocks the bishop on h6. So here white resigned. They're checkmated. Okay. So now you've made it to the end of the game. You understand the whole game, but I'm going to show you just a couple more brilliancies to show you the depth of this position a little bit, okay? So first we're going to come back to 2 moves ago when black goes rook c2. I'm going to try and introduce to you one of the coolest moves I've ever seen in chess. So rook c2 threatening this attack on g2. In this position here, Geller did actually have a defensive resource. The game was not dead yet. And it's an interference tactic, but a defensive interference tactic like nothing you've ever seen before. Because most interference tactics you've seen are the one on the attack, right? So d5. Remember that this bishop needs this diagonal and this queen needs this diagonal. White actually manages, by throwing away this pawn completely dead in the middle of the center on this light square, manages to trip up the black bishop and queen who are dominating all the light squares, while every white piece is off on a dark square, right? What is this little pawn doing? It's insane. But check it out. If you take with the bishop, you block your queen from going to b3. So now white could develop the rook somewhere. I mean, maybe begging for a trade. I would just go here. I think it's actually important because in some case against queen b6, we might need to double rooks to block that check. So we need this rook here to defend it. And after check, here, you can't go queen b3. You want your bishop back on b7. That would be like in the game, right? Or you'd have queen c4 check if the rook were on d1 instead of c1, right? In the game, the rook was on c1. But here the queen can't get anywhere with check, and I'm not really sure what black should do next. It's a mess. We sacked a rook for this, and we don't have a checkmate or a check. I mean, you've got checks like rook f2, but they're not good. And bishop c4, by the way, is not good because the king can take your rook. Okay, but what if we take with the queen, right? Then we still have access to b3, and we're still like really, really threatening g2, right? Amazingly, if you take with the queen, the rook can block on e4 because you're blocking your own bishop from taking that rook. And now white's threatening queen e8 checkmate as well as avoiding your checkmate. So white's kind of seizing the initiative from black here, right? They're threatening queen takes knight checkmate. If your knight moves, they've got queen g7 checkmate. So whoops. There it goes. Notice that, like, by comparison, in this position here, white couldn't block the diagonal at e4 because black would just take with the bishop. And then you still can't defend g2, but now you also aren't up a rook anymore. So one defensive resource here for white, d5. Amazing move. It was discovered in analysis, probably by the players. I think this game was much analyzed. I don't remember who found which move, so I can't give credit like people used to do. But you people are from the 21st century and probably don't even know about how in the old days people would give credit to different people for having come up with moves. Like if you were analyzing a game, you would say, d5 found by Max Euwe. And then, Geller found rook f1. You would like say who came up with the moves because back then people came up with the moves. It wasn't just all stockfish or Leela or Alpha Zero or whatever. So I'm afraid I can't ascribe credit, but somebody found this move in analysis, and then an incredible idea was found for black. Let's go back here, where rook h8 was given an exclam. I believe that I saw in some sources that black had a winning move here, which was absolutely astonishing, b4. So I gave it 2 exclams, even though rook h8 gets 1. It's even another level more brilliant. The plan is for white to take on b4 and then rook h8 to get 1 exclam again and win the game. I don't know who found this move. I heard that it wins. I've reanalyzed it with the help of a little computer engine that's not necessarily good. And actually, I think I found a way for white to survive even against this move. So this move's maybe not even necessarily better than rook h8. Each move is maybe good enough for a draw against an opposing supercomputer or whatever. But this move is insanely brilliant and instructive. So I show it to you, even though it's not one of the moves of the game, but it's right below the surface of this game, just bubbling there. What does this move do? Can anyone figure out what does the move b4 accomplish in this position? What are we doing, and what kind of a sacrifice is b4 as a pawn sacrifice? Is it interference or desperado or decoy or deflection or clearance? Blah, blah, blah. I don't know all the words that well off the top of my head. Okay, and I'll tell you the answer. This move opens some more light square diagonals. That's what it does. The b5 pawn was in the way of black's bishop and queen. Yes, you might have thought these pieces had free reign over the board, right? Especially after rook h8 decoying and deflecting white's queen off of the light squares. You might have thought they had free reign, but no, this pawn is in their way just a little bit. And you saw how even just this little pawn coming to d5 could get in their way. So chess pieces can be finicky, you know? Sometimes they're powerful, sometimes they're like, oh, there's a little pawn in my way. b4, and check out, if white takes, we get the idea in its full splendor. Rook h8, queen takes h8, rook c2 coming in on the light square here. d5, the brilliant defense from white, right? But now we've got more diagonals, so it doesn't successfully trip black. We take rook d1 like before, right? Like I showed you in the d5 defensive line white had. Check. King here. What's the new move and only winning move here? Whee! Pew! Off to the other side. Oh, one more open light square diagonal. The king gets pushed out here. Check. Up. Check, we chase him away from the rook. We recover the rook and then have a finishing winning attack against white, right? We're not down a rook anymore, and look at that king. I mean, it's a massacre. From here on out, you don't need to see anything more. Wow. So look at that, b4 laying the groundwork for surviving white's devilish d5 move, right? Just go through it one more time. a6, oh, and a2. Look at that queen run. So I heard that this move is winning for black, but I think that I found a move for white that that can actually still save white in this position. So I'm giving it 2 exclams as well. Rook f1, double exclam. All right, this move allows all kinds of violence from black, but let's start with the main line rook h8. We take rook c2 for the counter attack. And what does rook f1 do? Rook f6. Right in the middle of how many black pieces that are defending f6? 4. That'll show you your dark squares, black. So, if black takes with pawn or knight, they basically just get checkmated right away, right? Like, you see this checkmate once the knight's no longer defending dark squares. There's this. Or pawn takes, check, and same little mate, right? Okay, so it can't take with the pawn or the knight. If the queen takes, then we just play rook f4 for white, win the queen. I sacked a rook, but remember black sacked a rook, so now I'm just winning a queen for a rook. White's winning on material here. Rook g2, whatever. You just walk away. Just don't go in the corner. Don't go in the corner. King comes out, and there's no queen a6 because I pinned your queen. So the best move for black is this mind-boggling king f6, and a computer helped me to find that this is a draw with bishop g5, king g5, bishop g5 only move because if you like check the king, it just goes to g6 and escapes on light squares. Same with rook f4 here. You can't coordinate your pieces. So you have to get this out of the way of your rook and queen. Takes, check. Now if the king comes back here, I guess queen h7, and we can collect the rook. Oh, and stop the attack finally. Oh, thank goodness. So thank goodness our bishop's not in the way of the rook and queen coordination. So check, the king comes forward, and then we have rook f5, king e3, rook e5, or queen f5, knight f5, and this position is still an absolute mess to me because white's got a queen against a rook and bishop, g2's hanging, this pawn's almost queening, and apparently I couldn't go any further. I just asked the computer and it said, it's equal, with like 7 different variations to do it. It's not even like there's one way to do it. Absolute mess. So that's rook f6 and bishop g5 saving white here. And you might say this is like one of the longest strings of brilliant moves ever to not win a game, right? Between black playing b4, white playing rook f1, black rook h8, white rook f6, I just handed out like 15 exclamation marks in this variation, right? So So that is my absolute most brilliant possible line. B4 double exclam, rook F1 double exclam, ignoring it. Rook H8 giving the rook exclam, queen takes, rook C2 exclam, mating white. Notice that like rook F2 doesn't help because of queen E1 here, and you get mated. But instead, rook F6, tit for tat, right? Rook H8, rook F6, bam, and eventually a draw. Okay. So B4, rook F1. I thought that another good idea for black would be B3, going for rook C2 or B2, and queening the pawn. Maybe instead of sacking a rook, since that didn't quite win. And now it's still all total madness, but I think knight F5 is a good looking move for white, attacking G7 and preparing the way for a very, very strong move next, because black wants to go rook C2 and I want to go rook G4. And when I found rook G4, I thought this is probably looking really good for white, because now white's attacking and defending at once, and overall white feels a little more coordinated than black. But black has this trump that they're going to just queen this pawn if you don't win. And apparently after rook G8, white can't quite win, even though G7's hanging. You just can't quite checkmate the black king, and my B3 move, I guess, is strong enough that if you sit around, you're going to lose. And so the computer told me the best that you can do is to just trade everything here. And then give a perpetual, like queen H8, queen H7, or queen G7. Because G2's hanging and the B pawn's going, and you just don't have checkmate. So again, many brilliant moves and more or less equality. So that's the sharpness of what was going on in this game. Remember that Geller gave a pawn through the pieces at the black king side. Euwe manages to find some open lines in the center of the board, evacuates the king to not safety, but less deadness. And then brilliant moves upon brilliant moves. Rook H8, this idea of B4 is crazy. I hope you'll remember that move forever as well. B4, opening up queen A6. Not necessarily better than what he did with rook H8, queen H8, the counterattack. I'm repeating these to help you remember the game, right? The mate threat, rook here to stop queen C4 in this position, but queen B3, and she gets in anyway. So that's Geller Euwe. Fantastic example of hardly defending from both players as their kings are both getting checkmated, right? They just kept throwing everything at the opponent's king and said, well, yeah, I probably can't defend anyway because, he's attacking on dark squares and I've got a light squared bishop, right? So I'll go checkmate him on light squares. And, play through it a few times and then go show it to a friend, right? I mean, your friend will be electrified and thankful for you, and it'll help you to remember the game. All right, that's it for now. Happy sweat work. I'll see you around in the dojo.